I am so very excited about the celebration of my 60th birthday. And when I think back over the journey of 60 years, I really see the blessings that God has bestowed upon my life. Among those blessings are the people that whose paths have crossed my path. I don't take that for granted. It's not coincidental in any way. It has just been the will of God. And so it is those people, I believe, that have helped me to become who I am and who I am still becoming. We have often heard the phrase, I've been around the block. And so as I reflected on my journey, my 60-year journey, I kind of used that phrase to kind of break up that 60 years into 20-year segments. And I said to myself, well, for every 20 years of my life, that means for me that I've been around the block one time. I kind of look at that first 20 years from birth until age 20 as being a time of listening, learning, observing. And of course, that was a time of growing up as a child, and I feel that I had a wonderful childhood. A time of focus on, of course, the education process, a time of character building, a time of building relationships with friends who would become lifelong friends. And it was during these first 20 years, of course, that my mother gave me a great piece of advice. And that advice consisted of two things. She said, first, learn all that you can. And the second piece of that was to trust God. And so when I went off to college, my mother ordered for me and gave me actually a copy of several prayers. They were pre-printed prayers from a ministry called Life Study Fellowship. So she gave that to me as a gift in leaving home and going to college. And in a way, I felt that that was a way of her giving me some spiritual legs to stand on. And I've, of course, been raised in a Christian home, had observed a Christian lifestyle, had seen both of my parents pray, had seen them trust God. And so, it was her way of saying, okay, you are really out of the nest, but it's time for you to stand on your own two spiritual legs. So we move on to my second trip around the block, ages 21 to 40. And it was during this time that I, of course, graduated from college, got my first job, which was at what is now called AT&T in Birmingham, Alabama. Subsequently, got married, and some few years after that, had my wonderful children. They're blessings from God, Timothy Joshua and Joel Micah, whom of course, I really wanted to name Kenneth Stanford and Anthony Bradford. Those were my Ivy League names. But anyway, someone else won that decision. After having the children, I still had this plan to climb the corporate ladder. And at the time, I was working for IBM Corporation, as well as great plans as an entrepreneur. I still to this day have a spirit of entrepreneurship. However, in the process of what were my plans, there was another plan. And that plan was to co-found a church in 1984, that's 3 months after Timothy was born, called Frontier Christian Church. And 4 years later, that church gave birth to a Christian school, Restoration Academy, which is still a very viable school today after 27 years. And so that was somewhat a detour. It was not necessarily my plan, but evidently it was God's plan. In addition to the various roles, the many roles and the many balls that I juggled at that time, I continued to learn all that I could learn. And I continued the educational process, went to seminary, being involved in ministry, wanted to be prepared and wanted to be the best that I could be. And so continued my education by going to Birmingham Theological Seminary and obtaining a degree, and then additional courses at Beeson Divinity School. what I discovered in those detours is that those detours were just another opportunity to trust God. My plans were no longer my plans anymore. And so it was really a time of surrender and a time of trusting. So we move on to my third trip around the block. And those are the years between 41 and 60. As I mentioned earlier, the first trip around the block was about hearing, listening, and observing. During my second trip around the block, it was about believing. But this third trip around the block is about knowing. And so one of the major things that I have learned in the last 20 years has been the lesson of focus. It has been another lesson of knowing that I must run my own race, identifying my lane in the race, and staying in my lane. There have been times when I thought in the second trip around the block that it was my responsibility to change the world. But what I had to realize was that I am only assigned my piece of the planet. I learned the lesson of having balance. And balance for me has boiled down to working smart and playing hard. There was a time when someone told me I had two speeds, all out and over and out. But what I've learned in these 20 years is to find balance between those two, somewhere in the middle. So in review, my first trip around the block was listening, hearing, and observing. My second trip around the block was believing, trusting in God. My third trip around the block was knowing. And I am so excited as I embark upon my fourth trip around the block, ages 61 to 80. And in that trip, I will learn that I know what I know.